What you're seeing now are live visuals of the arrival of the Brazilian delegation led by President Lula da Silva. We've been anticipating them for quite some time now. They've finally touched down, and we'll certainly get a better sense of what their presence might mean. But of course, some of the obvious things that jump out is that the rotating G20 presidency that South Africa now has comes from Brazil, for lack of a better term. And after that, of course, will be passed on to the United States. All of this action is going to culminate in the summit that is being held at the Nasrec Expo Center at the weekend. It's where we find SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's been watching the moving parts with us as they unfold, Sherwin. And we've just heard from the EU delegation, and there's a very clear refrain that is emerging, at least if you heard what President Cyril Ramaphosa said yesterday when he was speaking alongside Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen. It's this concept of the partnership being predictable, reliable, and trustworthy.
And antithetical to what you might have heard from a president of the United States in this G20 context. I think very much framing their disposition towards the G20 in a very positive light. I'll just quickly run through what President Costa is, the EU Council President. He talked about commending President Ramaphosa and the South African team for the exceptional work towards an agreed outcome. He talked about no one can tackle global challenges alone. I wonder who he might have been speaking about there. He says we are here to work together. They believe in unlocking Africa's full potential. He talked about the importance of diversifying supply chains, which are important for the European Union. He talked about building strategic autonomy, right? Strategic autonomy. Think about the very close relationship that Europe and the United States has enjoyed for a very, very long time. Partners, many European countries, partnership in terms of NATO, that North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. He talked about the need for all G20 members to take collective action. He emphasized the importance of multilateral cooperation, not less. And I think very much talking to perhaps the unilateralism we've seen from certain powerful countries in the world. And then Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, she talked about how the EU is really pleased to be in Johannesburg. She talked about the AU and South Africa's historic first G20 a vote for Africa on the global stage. She talked about the importance of the G20 fostering a rules-based trade atmosphere within the global economy. She said rules-based trade delivers. She talked about the importance of openness and fairness in competition, very much antithetical to what we have seen emanating from the United States in terms of its trade relationships, its reciprocal tariffs. And then, talk about timing for President Lula of Brazil arriving just as the EU was speaking here. Another very close friend of South Africa. You'll know that President Lula was the former president of the G20, handed over the gavel to President Ramaphosa, is part of the troika that really has guided this process over the last year. They will exit now. The UK will come in, and so that troika continues with South Africa, the United States, and the United Kingdom, but also understands multilateralism in a way that the South Africans can really appreciate. President Lula is the former G20 president, but also the current president of COP30, the ongoing climate negotiations in Belém in Brazil near the Amazon. Those also seeking to usher in an agreement, an agreement based around consensus, which, let me tell you, Ayanda, is a very complicated thing to do with independent sovereign states seeking to form a broad coalition on some of the aspects in terms of moving forward. President Lula also forming the president of BRICS, currently hosting the BRICS Summit earlier in Brazil this year. So very much a multilateralist and very much a friend of South Africa. And you just sometimes need to see how President Lula embraces President Ramaphosa to understand that perhaps they understand something we don't know. And that's probably being on the receiving end of some of the unilateral decisions that the United States has handed out. Brazil on the receiving end of, I think, 50% tariffs we talked about, although those have been reduced for beef and coffee because of the expense that is impugned on American consumers. And so I think certainly a symbiosis between the president of Brazil and the president of South Africa and the presidents of the EU Council and the EU Commission, Ayanda.
Absolutely. You certainly do get the sense that we're pulling in one direction, at least insofar as these stakeholders are concerned. Once again, if you've just joined us, we've got live visuals of the arrival of the Brazilian delegation touching down officially on home soil. Sherwin Bryce-Pease is coming to us live from our satellite studios in Nasrec, which are about to become a hive of activity, no doubt, in the coming hours. And Sherwin, as we wait to finally catch sight of Lula da Silva, I suppose it's also worth speaking about the context upon which he also arrives, much of which you've just outlined. But I find it very interesting to also learn about the man himself. I mean, this is somebody who defeated Jair Bolsonaro, who was very much seen as a Trump ally. And I suppose he also comes into the space kind of buoyed by that, right? Given, I suppose, the frosty relations between South Africa and the US at the moment.
Buoyed, certainly, but then, of course, the coup trial against Jair Bolsonaro, who is seen as a close ally of President Trump, and the punitive actions you have seen from the United States based on that guilty conviction handed down by the Supreme Court in Brazil. And, of course, President Lula, in a sense, representing the Biden-Trump moment that we saw in the 2020 election, where it was also a very, very closely fought election. I think a few million votes here and there. But you know, I think it's the Workers' Party that President Lula is the president of, prevailing in that election. But that has framed a very frosty relationship with the President of the United States that believes that his ally Jair Bolsonaro has been treated unfairly by the Brazilian judicial system. But what we have seen from President Lula is he certainly hasn't shied away from punching back. And so he has criticized the tone that the President of the United States has used against independent institutions and the rule of law as they see it in Brazil. And so we talk a lot about the camaraderie, not just about having the same ideals, but also being on the receiving end of what the United States has been dishing out to countries that are gathered here this weekend.
Yeah, without a doubt. A big part, I imagine, of what Brazil will be hoping to push through as part of these high-level talks that are going to take place is undoubtedly pushing the interests of the global South. Given their own posture, they've spoken, this is the Brazilian delegation, a lot about inequality, food security, social development, and of course, leveraging this green energy transition that we also heard about from the EU delegation.
Absolutely, a very development-focused G20 presidency under President Lula, a very development-focused presidency of the BRICS group under President Lula, and a very development-focused presidency under Brazil for COP30. And so you will find a lot of synergy between President Lula of Brazil and the South African delegation. And remember, they've worked very, very closely together on issues that are, countries that face similar issues in the global South, and really capping off what has been this trajectory that started in Indonesia, handing over to the Indians, handing over to the Brazilians, handing over to the South Africans, and of course, now handing over to the United States. So what happens to that agenda is going to be a very, very big talking point as these leaders gather around that round table in the plenary alongside where we are. But certainly interesting to see how the leaders are arriving. There we go. Ayanda, maybe you want to take it from here?
Absolutely, we will, Sherwin. Thanks very much indeed. We can certainly see some of the leaders arriving at OR Tambo International Airport. This is part of the Brazilian delegation, once again, officially touching down, led by Lula da Silva, a good friend of South Africa, and as you've heard, has, it seems, good relations even with President Cyril Ramaphosa.